They did not tear her boarding pass, but the way they looked at it, then looked at her, was 1,000 times worse than any ripped paper. It was a declaration that needed no sound. You do not belong here. In that moment, no one at Los Angeles International Airport knew they had just triggered the biggest explosion in this airline's history. An explosion with no fire and no smoke, only the silence of a woman powerful enough to place an entire system on the operating table. And they, the ones who thought they were fixing a small inconvenience, were about to face the truth. They had humiliated the wrong person. Very wrong. The airport breathed like a giant beast. Cold white lights, distorted announcements, the scrape of suitcase wheels against unforgiving tile, the entire space pulsing with a familiar rhythm, chaotic but functional, a world where the smallest oversight could lead to disaster. And at the edge of that chaos, Dr. Natalie Pierce stood still, 46 years old, calm, discreet, with nothing on her that revealed her authority. No badge, no rank, only eyes sharpened by 2 decades of dissecting accidents, inspecting every weld, every bolt, every lie told by major airlines. She stood there small in the sea of bodies, yet carrying a silence that made the world hesitate. A minimalist navy suit, silent black shoes, hair neatly pinned, a steel watch cold on her wrist, not a single excess detail, not a single loose crease. She did not need to display power. She was power. In her hand was a Toomey suitcase holding a 400-page preliminary investigation report on an engine failure that, if luck had tilted half a degree, could have claimed over 100 lives. By morning, that report needed to be on a Senate desk by morning. If anything slipped by even half a minute, an entire industry would tremble. She could not miss this flight. She also had no idea that this flight would be the real test waiting for her. Gate C-18 was packed. The system had just announced a delay. Passengers were restless. Flight attendants were stone-faced. Overhead, LED lights flickered like an overloaded circuit. At the boarding counter, Linda Roberts, 45 years old, her face wrinkled into a permanent crumple, hammered the keyboard with enough force to snap a key, worn out, irritated, and worst of all certain, that her tiny piece of authority allowed her to judge others. First-class boarding. Now Linda called her voice dry as rusted metal. Natalie stepped forward, her movements light and precise, the way someone who knows every safety protocol by heart moves. She handed over her boarding pass and passport. Linda scanned it. A sharp beep sounded jarring and accusatory, as though announcing a crime in a crowded square. Linda narrowed her eyes, her mouth curling with annoyance. "This one is flagged." Natalie remained composed. Flagged for what reason, Linda let out a sigh, the kind that says she had no intention of explaining anything, only enforcing it. Seat 1A is duplicated. The system reassigned it automatically. I will print your new ticket. A new ticket, a flimsy piece of paper that in Linda's hands could become a public humiliation. Natalie looked straight at her, her gaze unshaken. I booked 1A 8 weeks ago. There was no aircraft change, no reroute. So where is my seat now? Linda printed the new ticket from an old machine, the paper dragging out with a harsh, scraping noise. She placed it on the counter like a dismissal. 35B. The words dropped like a verdict. 2 rows from the back, a middle seat beside the lavatory, the worst place, the most visible place, and of course the farthest from first class. Natalie did not move. She did not need to. She simply shifted her gaze cold as tempered glass. Please check the manifest again." But Linda had already turned away, her eyes gliding over the long line of passengers, as if saying, "You are wasting my time. You may wait for the 8 o'clock flight if you do not want 35B. A hidden slap. Natalie did not flinch. "Then who is currently in seat 1A?" as if summoned by fate. Brianna Hale, 23 years old influencer with millions of followers dressed in a Balenciaga dress and live streaming with energetic steps bounced up to the counter. "Hi, I am Bri Hale. Is my seat ready?" Linda transformed instantly. Her face brightened like a skincare commercial, her voice soft as clouds. "Miss Hale, of course your seat is 1A. Everything is ready." Natalie watched the exchange, not angry, not hurt, only silent in a way that signaled a machine had begun turning. She had witnessed countless failures in her career, but this blend of discrimination, misuse of power and incompetence was a dangerous formula, not because it was large, but because it was small and repeated endlessly. And these small, careless violations of procedure were the ones that killed people. She accepted the 35B ticket. No argument. None needed. In her mind, a different process had started, not a boarding procedure, but data collection, identifying violation patterns, recording behavior, recording tone, recording language. And one day, the people who thought they could determine passenger worth based on appearance would be writing explanations with their entire careers. Natalie walked into the jet bridge. The fluorescent lights fell across her calm face. The camera of this story would zoom slowly into her eyes, where there was no anger, only the razor-sharp clarity of someone who knew that justice does not need to shout justice, only needs to record. She tightened her grip on the Toomey suitcase. Inside it waited hundreds of pages of evidence against another airline ready for Senate review. But she knew very well that the airline she was stepping into would soon join that list. She simply did not yet know how quickly everything would spiral out of their control, how from the moment that beep sounded, every rotting link in a failing system had begun revealing itself. The camera followed her steps into the cabin. First class gleamed. Champagne poured smoothly. The influencer live-streamed enthusiastically from seat 1A, and there, standing like a human barrier purser, Mark Vance blocked the aisle. He smirked. "What are you looking for up here? 35 is far, far back." Natalie looked at him, not defiant, not apologetic, only assessing her gaze, capturing every detail exactly the way she would for an official report. He did not know. No one knew. But in that warm yellow cabin light, the entire American aviation industry was standing at the edge of an event that would force it to examine its own soul integrity, safety fairness. Natalie said nothing. Her hand tightened slightly on her suitcase handle. Her silence echoed louder than any threat. And from that second on, it was not she who stepped onto the aircraft. It was a full-scale investigation that had just stepped into their lives. The crowd surged into the cabin like an invisible current, while Natalie moved quietly against it, unnoticed, her every step carrying the precision of someone who had walked through the wreckage of aviation disasters far too many times. No one saw her eyes capturing every detail, as if the smallest violations were revealing themselves under the cold glow of the metal ceiling lights. She passed the first-class cabin, where champagne filled crystal glasses, and where social media elites flaunted their fame as if it were a passport to privilege. Brianna Hale beamed into her camera, showing off a privilege she believed was as natural as oxygen. None of them knew that privilege had just been purchased with the humiliation of another passenger. Mark Vance blocked Natalie's path like a door programmed to deny access. His eyes scanned her simple suit, then returned to her face with sarcasm thinly covered by cheap politeness. He did not ask for her ticket. He did not need to check any list. He relied on the most dangerous instinct in aviation intuition, built on prejudice. "Behind you, keep going farther down," he said, his voice gentle like a direction, but sharp like a blade slicing dignity. That sentence triggered in Natalie not anger, but the solemn silence of a legal system beginning to operate. The switch flipped in her mind, transforming her from passenger to investigator. Record the tone. Record the attitude. Record the intentional humiliation. Everything was stored with the cold precision of an investigation report. When she walked deeper into economy, the damp odor from the rear lavatory wrapped around her like a deliberate insult. The seats were cramped, her knees pressed against the seat in front. The yellow light fell on her skin, creating the sensation of being trapped in a narrow and grim corridor in stark contrast to the front of the plane, where laughter and clinking glasses continued. But Natalie did not lower her head. Not ever. Her gaze remained steady, like a lake frozen over, reflecting the arrogance of those who had pushed her back here. What they did not know was that from these lowest positions, she had witnessed the biggest weaknesses, the errors most easily ignored, the dangers most often dismissed, and these were the very things capable of destroying an airline with only a few lines in her report. She placed her suitcase at her feet, opened her black notebook, and her pen slid out like a weapon. The first lines appeared sharp, clear, emotionless. They pushed her to the last row, but that act was not their ending. It was the beginning. Because from the moment her pen touched the paper, this flight was no longer a flight. It had become an investigation. And that investigation began with the very mistake they believed was just a simple seat adjustment. They thought they were fixing a minor inconvenience. But from this moment, she, the silent woman who had been degraded without a word, was the one who would decide how big the inconvenience would become. And she would not warn them. She would only record, and let them face the consequences themselves. Soft thuds rippled along the fuselage as more passengers were squeezed into the cabin, while Natalie sat in the center of seat 35B like the silent eye of a storm. Evan Miles, the young flight attendant, strapped into the jump seat across from her, watched with the scattered worry of someone new to the job. His eyes blinked rapidly, avoiding hers as if afraid she might see the deeper fear weighing on him, a fear larger than the tight cabin around them. But he was not the problem, not the target, not the one who put her here. The problem lay ahead, a system far too accustomed to dismissing procedures, dismissing passengers, and dismissing the consequences their complacency could cause. The aircraft door closed. The atmosphere shifted. A dense quiet settled in, as if the entire cabin understood they were sealed inside this metal container, together with no escape until landing. Natalie lifted her pen and added another line. The purser displayed contemptuous behavior, violated service standards, and showed signs of discriminatory conduct. The words were sharp as blades, each one weighted like evidence. Evan glanced at her notebook, then back up his lips, parting as if he wanted to speak, but could not. He understood one thing: this woman was not like the mistreated passengers he had seen before. There was something in her gaze, not fear, not anger, but absolute control, a silence that made him feel observed, evaluated, measured. And in that moment, Evan realized the real fear did not come from turbulence or mechanical issues. It came from being the cause of a violation he could never undo. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began to taxi. Natalie sat upright, her eyes fixed forward. She always sat like that during critical moments, the kind where everything could go wrong because of one tiny action overlooked. The wheels screeched, then lifted off the runway, a slight jolt followed by the relieved exhale of many passengers, an exhale Natalie never participated in. Safety never meant safe. It only meant nothing had gone wrong yet. Then the cabin shook violently. A deep, sudden drop jolted the entire row, sending the glass of water on the tray in front of Natalie splashing upward in droplets. Small cries rang out from behind. Evan jerked up in shock, then froze, completely gripping the jump seat as fear locked his body. A dangerous sign. A flight attendant mustn't freeze, not when the cabin needs them most. Not when their fear could spread like contagion. Natalie tilted her head toward Evan, her eyes sharp as metal under the cabin lights. He trembled, his breathing shallow, his hands pale. A louder crash followed. A service cart shot loose from the rear galley like a runaway animal. Evan barely reacted, only stared. And in the moment when a competent purser should have appeared, Mark was nowhere in sight. No instructions, no reassurance, no leadership. The cabin dissolved into confused disorder. Natalie set her pen down, rose slightly, and leaned toward Evan. Her voice, low but firm, carrying the authority of FAA regulations. Secure the cart. Now, Evan's eyes widened. He inhaled sharply. Panic receded just long enough for instinct to return. He lunged forward, locked the wheels, latched the safety bar, then checked the back row for injuries. A few passengers looked at Natalie, not as a troublemaker, but as the only one who knew exactly what to do. The turbulence eased. The cabin fell still, a stillness that did not feel safe. Evan returned to his seat, exhaling shakily, his eyes flicking to her again and again. He had realized something painful. The woman in seat 35B had just performed the job his purser should have done. Natalie opened her notebook and wrote 3 more entries. Short, precise, cold, cart unsecured, injury risk. Junior attendant froze, lack of training and supervision. Purser absent from aft cabin during critical moment. She wrote no commentary. She needed no emotion. Only data. The cabin remained heavy with unspoken tension. Evan's shame, passengers' lingering fear, and the invisible arrogance of those who believed rules could be bent with a smile or a dismissive tone. Mark finally appeared casually, sweeping aside the curtain, as if the rear cabin were nothing more than decoration. He looked at Natalie. His eyes carried the discomfort of a man sensing something slipping beyond his control, yet still convinced he could threaten, manipulate, or rewrite reality with his voice. "Everything all right back here?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock concern. No apology. No acknowledgement. No responsibility. Only the delusional confidence of someone who believed the uniform protected him from consequences. Natalie looked up. Her gaze cut straight through the veneer of arrogance. Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second, a tiny stutter in his expression, but enough to reveal that a sense of danger had flickered awake. "Fine," she replied, her tone low, clean, razor-sharp. "I have documented everything." Mark narrowed his eyes. Documented. Natalie did not answer. She simply placed her hand on the notebook and closed it with a soft click, but to Mark, it sounded like the release of a safety catch on a loaded weapon. He walked away with heavier steps. For the first time on this flight, The rear cabin no longer felt like a place he could dominate with a few cutting remarks. Natalie leaned gently back into her seat. Not victorious, not angry, simply prepared. Because she knew the most important moment had not yet arrived. The aircraft pierced through a layer of clouds, and down here her investigation was approaching completion. When the plane touched the ground, no one in that crew would be able to stand firm against the truth they had built for themselves. Natalie closed her eyes for a brief second. She did not pray. She counted. 1, 2, 3. The procedure in her mind locked into place. They thought they had confined her to the worst seat, but they were the ones sealing themselves into a report that would follow them for the rest of their careers. And in that moment, Natalie's silence became the loudest sound on the entire flight. They simply did not know it yet. But they would soon. Very soon. Just after Mark disappeared behind the curtain, the intercom crackled to life with a faint static, as if even the system itself was irritated. His voice filled the cabin, lazy and mocking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin beverage service in the first-class cabin first. As for the back, if you are lucky, you will get your turn." A few passengers gave awkward laughs. A few exchanged unhappy glances. Natalie did not laugh. She tilted her head slightly, as though she was not listening to his words, but to the fractures beneath them, the layers of sloppy work habits, attitudes far beyond the boundaries of service, and the growing contempt for passengers being exposed piece by piece. Evan pushed the beverage cart toward the rear rows, his hand still trembling, but his eyes were different now. No longer pure fear. It was the awareness that every movement he made was being observed by someone who understood every millimeter of FAA regulations. When he reached row 35, Evan stopped. "What would you like to drink?" His voice was small, polite, procedural. "Water. No ice." Evan reached for the bottle, but before he could pour, Mark appeared behind him, placing his hand on the bottle as if snatching control away. "We are out of bottled water. You will drink tap." His voice threw the words like punishment. Evan froze. A few passengers turned to look. Mark leaned down toward Natalie, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep 2 rows from hearing it. "Go ahead. Write all you want. But troublemaking passengers always end up in the back. Remember that." His arrogance seeped into the air, an invisible rot everyone could smell except him. Natalie lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no anger in her gaze, only a stillness that made Mark's breath hitch for a split second, the stillness of someone who fully understood the legal weight of every word she would record. "Thank you," she said. "That information is very useful." Mark's smile froze, but he still walked away as if he had won something. Evan poured the tap water for her hands, shaking slightly, eyes full of guilt. "I'm sorry. It is not your fault." Only 4 words, but firm and clear enough that Evan felt her judgment of him was not the same as her judgment of Mark. He pushed the cart away, standing a little straighter than before. Natalie opened her notebook and wrote a new entry, threatening a passenger retaliatory behavior purser. The line was short and cold, like a verdict carved long before the accused realized he was being watched. Half an hour later, the aircraft lurched violently as it entered a wind-shear corridor above the Rocky Mountains. This was not mild turbulence. It was a twist that sent the entire cabin tilting sharply to one side. Screams burst from a few passengers. The man in the seat beside Natalie, who had been glued to his phone, grabbed the armrest with a white knuckle grip. Oh my God, is the plane falling? Natalie sat perfectly still, eyes on the window. She measured the wing flex, the elastic bend of the wing, by sight alone. The winds were strong, but not dangerous. Not the kind of event that would cause loss of control. The real danger was not outside. It was inside. Evan was trembling. His lips muttered something incoherent. His hands clutched his seatbelt until his knuckles turned white. He should not be afraid like that. He was a flight attendant, the person passengers looked to for stability, but no one had taught him how to stay calm. And the purser, nowhere. Evan, Natalie said quietly, but in the turbulent cabin, her voice cut through the thick air and reached him directly. He looked up, eyes wide, panicked. Look at me, he looked, trembling, waiting for instruction. There is nothing dangerous. This is just heavy chop. You need to stand up. Secure the cart. Check the last 2 rows. People are watching you. Evan inhaled sharply. The training buried under fear snapped awake slow but real. He unbuckled his harness, stood and walked toward the galley. His first steps were shaky, but each next step grew steadier. He locked the cart, anchored it to the wall, latched the safety hooks, then spoke to nearby passengers in a new voice, small but clear, and no longer broken. We are safe. The captain has control of the situation. Passengers breathed easier. Evan looked back at Natalie. Gratitude and shame mingled in his eyes. She nodded. No smile. No need. The turbulence faded. But the silence that followed was not normal. It was a silence for thinking, for fear, for realizing that they had just witnessed a critical failure, a moment when no one in the crew had been able to lead the cabin except a passenger. And that truth hung in the air when Mark Vance finally appeared at the rear, smoothing his hair as if he had just saved an entire planet. "What is going on back here?" he asked, annoyed. Evan clenched his fists. The cart slid loose. "I secured it." Mark looked at Natalie, a quick glance. But in that single glance, he knew. He sensed danger instinctively, like a wild animal recognizing the footprints of a predator. She was watching him, not with the curiosity of a difficult passenger, but with the cold authority of someone who had the power to expose every violation in the airline. "No issue," Mark said, forcing his voice smooth. "Everything is under control." Natalie lifted her gaze. It pinned him in place like a metal bolt driven into the floor. I did not see anyone in control. Only 7 words. Not loud. Not threatening. But the cabin fell so silent they could hear the engines humming outside the fuselage. Mark stood straighter, chest rising and falling. For the first time, he was no longer certain he held the upper hand. In Natalie's notebook, a new line appeared like the final cut of a blade. Purser absent during a critical moment requiring leadership. Serious violation. She closed the notebook. A soft click. But in Mark's mind, it echoed like a prison door slamming shut. They still did not know who she was. But they were beginning to understand that the woman in seat 35B was not someone they could silence with arrogance, and the real disaster was coming for them one line of ink at a time. Right after the turbulence faded, the cabin fell into a silence stretched tight like a wire. A silence that was not peaceful, but the kind that settles right before someone makes another mistake. And Mark Vance, armed with the false confidence of someone who had spent years bullying passengers, was the first to step into it. He marched back into the rear cabin with a look of irritation, as if Natalie herself had caused the aircraft to shake. Evan shifted aside, shoulders folding inward. Mark glanced at the black notebook resting on Natalie's lap, and his eyes tightened as though the pages were reciting every mistake he had made before he even had the chance to pretend to fix them. He leaned down, speaking quietly enough to appear confidential, yet loudly enough to display dominance to anyone nearby. "I see you writing plenty," he said with a cold smile. "Let me warn you now, disruptive passengers usually end up on a watch list. Do not make me call security to meet you at the gate." A soft gasp came from a passenger behind them. Evan turned pale. Natalie remained still. She did not lift her head. She did not respond. She simply flipped to a clean page and wrote a single short line, sharp as a blade slicing through metal. "Threatened passenger with false accusation abuse of authority." Mark looked at the writing as if his name had just been carved into stone. He let out an awkward laugh. "Who do you think you are? A blogger? A secret inspector? That doesn't scare me at all." His last sentence landed exactly as the cabin shook again, causing the overhead light to sway and cast a shifting shadow across his face, revealing for an instant an emptiness behind his eyes, a crack in his carefully polished arrogance. It was only a moment, but Natalie saw it. A fracture, a tiny break in his armor. She lifted her head for the first time since he approached. Her gaze held no anger, no confusion, only a quiet force that made every abuser of power feel their heart skip. "You are the purser," Natalie said, her voice a line drawn in steel. "You are responsible for your professional conduct. I am documenting everything." Mark froze. A flicker of fear, a flicker of denial, but he forced himself back into his usual posture of arrogance, even though it was crumbling at the edges. "Write whatever you want. I do not care," he said, turning away as if he had won a battle. But the hand gripping his ID badge trembled. Evan saw it. A few passengers saw it. And Mark himself knew he had just stepped backward into the shadow of the biggest mistake of his career. Natalie set her pen down. Light. Slow, but final. She still had not revealed her authority. She did not need to. Real power was not in shouting. It was in being the point where every violation converged, and those responsible had nowhere to escape. Beverage service resumed. Evan returned, trying to make up for earlier failures with pure effort. But Mark, like an animal, sensing a threat, slipped up behind him again. This time he was not smiling. "Watch your mouth," he hissed into Evan's ear, his voice sharp as a needle. "Do not let me hear you cooperating with that passenger." From seat 35B, Natalie heard every word. She wrote another line, interfering with staff applying psychological pressure on junior crew risk of violating human safety standards. She did not look up. She did not react. And once again, that silence made Mark turn for a longer look. This time, the annoyance in his eyes had shifted into something else. Unease. A passenger in seat 34C, the grumbling man from earlier, leaned toward Natalie and whispered, "I saw that. He's going too far. This airline is getting worse." Natalie gave a small nod, saying nothing. The man swallowed suddenly, understanding she was not the type to demand justice with noise. She was the type to sink an entire system under the weight of truth. As the cabin slowly settled again, a different kind of tension grew. Passengers were beginning to sense the quiet battle unfolding between a woman pushed to the last row and a purser desperately clinging to his authority with empty threats. They did not know two things. First, this woman was not an ordinary passenger. Second, the airline was about to find itself in the most dangerous position possible under the magnifying glass of the highest authority in aviation. Natalie glanced toward the aisle, where light from the first-class cabin spilled downward like a line separating two worlds. Brianna was still live-streaming. Others were still sipping champagne. They lived in another reality, one they believed had nothing to do with her or this cramped cabin. They did not know that from seat 35B a storm had already begun to form. She placed the notebook on her lap and pressed her fingers lightly against the corner of the page, as if locking a safety catch into place. The truth was enough. The evidence was complete. As the aircraft pushed deeper into the grey-blue clouds, no one realized that the fate of the entire crew had already been written in Natalie Pierce's short, silent, uncompromising lines. And all that remained was the moment she stepped onto solid ground. The air in the cabin began to thicken in a way no passenger could see, but every flight attendant could feel a shift in invisible pressure, as if power itself were moving from the front of the aircraft all the way down to the last row. And at the center of that shift sat Natalie Pierce, silent, unmoving, pulling an entire system into the orbit she chose. Evan continued working the aisle, sweat dampening the back of his uniform, but his eyes no longer held panic. Each time he passed Natalie, he stood a little straighter, executed each motion with more precision, as though simply being near her demanded correctness. Good people often recognize that true power does not come from shouting, but from intentional silence, and he was standing beside a silence strong enough to make the aircraft's skin tremble. Meanwhile, Mark was coming apart. He walked up and down the cabin several times, trying to create the illusion of purpose, but his movements were stiff and unnatural. A man accustomed to holding the upper hand was now feeling something he had never faced in his entire career, the fear of being observed by someone who could end that career with only a few paragraphs. But Mark still did not know who was sitting in seat 35B. All he knew was one thing: the farther he stayed from that woman, the better. And that was exactly the weakness Natalie had recognized long ago, the fear that blooms in abusers when confronted by someone who refuses to bow. The cabin shuddered again, gently, like a warning tap. Over the speakers, the captain's voice came on calm, but carrying weight. Flight attendants perform a cabin check. Evan stood immediately and began inspecting the rear rows. But Mark, the one required to supervise and direct, was still stuck in the forward cabin, chatting with Brianna, as if the rhythm of aircraft safety meant nothing. Natalie saw everything. She tilted her notebook and wrote another line. Purser failed to carry out required cabin check direct risk to flight safety. Each line she wrote was another door closing behind Mark and Linda, and they had no idea they were walking deeper into a dead end. Evan returned, breathing heavily. "It's all good back here," he whispered. "I checked everything." "You did well," Natalie replied. For the first time, her voice held a trace of warmth, but that warmth did not weaken her authority. It simply opened a path forward for him. A path Mark was blocking for himself, one mistake at a time. But the brief calm shattered as Mark appeared again at the rear cabin, not to perform a safety check, but to prove one thing that he refused to be corrected by a passenger. "Evan," he said, his voice sliding like a blade against steel, "you can skip this section. Whoever is in the last rows, they do not need much attention. A direct hit to the professional integrity of a trainee." Evan looked at him, eyes reddening. Natalie watched both of them, saying nothing, but her gaze stripped Mark's words bare. They do not need care. The last rows are not important. Not important because of who sits there or because of the specific person sitting there. Mark realized she heard every word. He turned, attempting to mask his discomfort with disdain. You don't need to keep writing. Nothing you write will go anywhere. Natalie slowly placed her hand on the cover of her notebook. It is not meant to go anywhere, she said, her voice steady, like molten steel being poured into a mold. It is meant to go exactly where it belongs. Mark narrowed his eyes. Are you trying to provoke me? No, Natalie answered. I am doing my job. The 2 rows around them fell silent. An older woman in seat 34A froze mid-sip after hearing that voice, because Natalie did not sound like any passenger she had ever encountered. She sounded calm in a way that carried authority. Mark felt a chill along his spine, but forced himself to hold his posture like a stray dog trying to scare away danger with a toothless growl. Do you know where you are sitting? He asked, lowering his voice but sharpening the venom. The lowest class. The worst spot. The part of the plane no one cares about. Natalie lifted her face and looked directly at him. Wrong, she said. I am sitting in the perfect place to see every violation you are trying to hide. Mark stepped back half a pace, involuntary. Evan stared at him, witnessing for the first time the shattering of the man he had feared. Just as Mark opened his mouth to retaliate, a sharp ding sounded from the overhead communication panel. Evan froze. Mark turned toward the front, his expression tightening, like someone being summoned to a parent-teacher meeting. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned, this time firm. Perseverance, report to the cockpit. Evan turned to Natalie, eyes wide. Mark went pale. He forced a smile brittle as cracked plastic. Probably something small they need me to handle, he muttered. But no one believed him. No one thought it was small. Evan watched him leave and whispered, What's happening? Natalie closed her notebook, a slow, decisive movement like sealing a steel door. They may have just read an email, she sobbed. Evan blinked. What email? Natalie looked forward through the cabin, through the curtain, through the invisible network connecting the aircraft to headquarters. The email I sent from seat 35B, she said. Her voice was low but carried weight, and the recipient is not in the lowest class. Up front, Mark's hurried footsteps faded into the cockpit. In the rear cabin, Natalie remained seated calm in a way that felt terrifying. No one understood the moment yet. But in just minutes, the entire flight crew would understand with chilling clarity. They had not merely insulted a passenger. They had insulted the one person in the industry with the authority to drag the entire airline into the light of legal scrutiny. And this landing would not just be an arrival. It would be the final bell for those who had ignited the storm, named Natalie Pierce. The cockpit door closed at the front, but its echo rolled all the way down to the rear cabin like a verdict not yet spoken. Mark disappeared behind the curtain, and the cabin sank into a strange atmosphere, not quiet, but expectant. A primal tension made everyone hold their breath, as if something was happening in a place no one could see. Natalie did not look up. She did not watch him go. She did not need to. She knew the communication protocols between ground control and the cockpit. She knew how a single line of text could drain the color from an entire flight crew's faces in seconds. And she knew that the moment the captain said Mark's name, the game was over. Evan sat in his jump seat, trembling lightly, but his eyes stayed fixed forward, as if trying to catch every word through the cracks in the cockpit door. A few passengers leaned, subtly guided by instinct more than curiosity, sensing that the conversation between the captain and the purser might decide someone's fate, and everyone prayed that someone was not them. Natalie opened her notebook again. A new page. Her pen moved quickly and sharply. Purser summoned to cockpit, urgently, likely related to report escalated to management. She wrote the line as calmly as one might describe the weather, but in truth, she was recording the moment. A pressure column of authority shifted direction. It was moving from the uniform to the truth. 5 minutes passed like a heartbeat, held motionless in mid-air. The cabin was silent. Evan fidgeted. The man beside Natalie whispered, "What did you do to make them call him up there?" "Not me," Natalie said. "Their system." The man swallowed and did not ask another question. The answer was not only correct, it was frightening. And then the curtain opened again. Mark stepped out. Gone was the confident stride. Gone was the posture of someone accustomed to standing above passengers. What walked down the aisle now was a man trying to swallow something far larger than himself. He moved slowly, very slowly, as if the floor of the airplane had turned into thin ice, and each step threatened to send him plunging through. Evan stared at him, exhaling sharply, because even without training, anyone could see the change. Mark looked like someone returning from a conversation with a person who held the power to erase his entire career with a single decision. Mark cast a quick glance toward the rear cabin. His eyes met Natalie's, and he immediately looked away. No words, no challenge, no pretense. He did not dare. Natalie tilted her head slightly, not out of pride, but as if confirming a hypothesis. Mark Vance had just learned that the woman in seat 35B was not an easy target to crush. She was someone who could bring an entire airline to its knees. Evan jumped up from the jump seat. "What happened, Mark?" Mark lifted a hand as if trying to push the question out of the air. "Quiet. Do your job." His voice had lost its edge. No venom. Only pressure compacted and brittle, trying to hide the tremor underneath. Evan stepped back, eyes wide. He turned to Natalie, no longer able to hide his confusion and awe. Why does he look like that? Natalie closed her notebook. Perhaps someone just explained the consequences of threatening the wrong person. A few passengers heard her. Their faces shifted, not because they feared her, but because, suddenly, they understood that the woman shoved into the last row was not an ordinary victim. Not someone who stayed silent to avoid trouble. Not someone whose worth could be decided by her seat assignment or her clothes. She was something else. Someone larger. Before the cabin could regain its rhythm, the aircraft tilted gently, beginning its descent. A single ding echoed through the speakers. The captain's voice returned now more formal than any routine announcement. "We are beginning our approach. All flight attendants take your positions." No one spoke for several seconds after that announcement. Only the clicks of seat belts, snapping the faint clatter of equipment in the galley, and the rising pulse of those who understood this flight was no longer a flight, but an inspection. As Evan prepared to sit in his jump seat, he leaned slightly toward Natalie and whispered, You are not like the other passengers." Natalie looked straight ahead. She did not smile. She did not confirm. She did not deny. She simply said, "I am only doing what is right." But if they knew who you were, Evan began, unable to finish. Natalie cut him off, sharp but gentle. "They will know soon enough." She was right. At the front of the cabin, Mark stood frozen like a statue, staring at the cockpit door, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to look back at the woman he once dismissed. That door, the place where Captain Hayes had summoned him, moments earlier, was now the boundary between fabricated authority and unavoidable truth. In just a few minutes, when the aircraft touched the ground, nothing would shield him. Not his uniform, not his title, not his hollow power. The cabin shuddered softly, signaling the landing gear lowering. Natalie placed her hand on her suitcase, feeling each vibration like a countdown. Only one step remained. When the wheels hit the runway, every layer of pretense within this flight crew would be torn away under the light of the woman they forced into seat 35B. And in that single moment, the moment of touchdown, the entire airline would cross the line between before and after. The aircraft touched the runway with a landing so smooth it contradicted completely the storm of authority waiting on the other side of the cockpit door. Yet the moment the wheels made contact, the air inside the cabin changed. No one understood why, but everyone felt it. Something far bigger than this flight had just begun. Natalie opened her eyes. Not quickly, not urgently. She simply placed her hand on her suitcase, the way someone does when a job is finished, not the way a passenger prepares to leave a plane. Evan glanced at her tension written across his face. He knew a wave was coming, but not what it carried. And Mark stood like an overstretched rubber band on the verge of snapping. As the aircraft rolled into its parking position, the intercom crackled. It was not the confident voice they were used to. It was the voice of a captain who had moved from confusion to shock in a matter of minutes. All passengers, please remain seated. We will conduct a deplaning procedure under specific direction from the crew. A few people looked up. A few exchanged whispers. A few phones began recording. Anything that disrupts normal deplaning is abnormal, and abnormal in aviation means serious. Evan swallowed hard. What are they doing? Natalie did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on the aisle ahead, where the white light from the jet bridge filtered through the curtain. They are preparing to correct a mistake. The aircraft door opened, but instead of passengers being invited to leave, a man in a black suit stepped aboard, first his ID badge glinting under the cabin lights, his stride quick and tight with urgency. Behind him were two airport security officers. Several passengers held their breath. Evan's eyes widened, and Mark froze like concrete setting in winter air. The man in the suit scanned the cabin, his gaze stopping at row 35. The moment his eyes found Natalie, his expression changed. Not surprise, but deep respect mixed with the panic of someone standing in front of a superior far above his rank. He walked straight to her. Mark saw him. Mark knew his name. Adam Greer, Vice President of Compliance. A man even the Director of Flight Operations called Sir, and he was walking toward the passenger Mark had threatened to have arrested. Adam stopped at row 35. Dr. Pierce. The entire cabin snapped around. Natalie looked up. Mr. Greer. He gave a slight nod. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement of responsibility. On behalf of the airline, I am here to escort you off the aircraft. A passenger whispered audibly, "Who is she?" Evan's mouth fell open. Mark stood 3 meters away, rooted to the floor. Natalie rose, lifting her suitcase, with movements straight, precise, free of any wasted motion. As she stepped into the aisle, the walkway unfolded before her like a path truth had paved long before this moment. Evan rose, instinctively whispering without thinking. You're part of some agency." Natalie looked at him, serious but gentle. "The agency responsible for ensuring every flight is safe for you." He could not breathe for several seconds. She continued forward. And that was when Mark shattered. Wait, Dr. Pierce." His voice trembled like a live wire touching water. I didn't know. I didn't mean Natalie stopped. Turned. Not angry. Not wounded. Only delivering the calm judgment of someone who knew the law and enforced it. "You do not need to know who I am," she said. "You only need to know who you were supposed to be." Mark recoiled as if struck. She continued walking. As she entered the first-class cabin, Brianna Hale's gaze met hers. The young influencer lifted an eyebrow, annoyed that a low-tier passenger was passing through her space. But when Adam said, "Make way for Dr. Pierce," Brianna's expression froze. For the first time, she sensed she had taken a seat she had no right to touch. When Natalie stepped through the aircraft door, dozens of phones lifted behind her. Some people did not know what was happening. Some knew enough to recognize that this was not an ordinary moment. She entered the jet bridge. Adam walked beside her. At the far end, Linda, the one who reassigned her seat, stood waiting, flanked by 2 security officers. Her face was ash white. Her fingers clutched her ID badge like it was the last fragment of authority she had left. Natalie walked past her and stopped for half a second. Linda's voice cracked as she tried to speak. I didn't mean to. I was just following. Natalie cut her off." "You were not following anything. You were choosing." Linda burst into tears. Her badge slipped from her hand and hit the floor. Natalie walked on. Behind her at the aircraft door, it was now Mark's turn to be escorted out to face the consequences he had created for himself, living proof that a few moments of disrespect can destroy a career decades long. And in that soundless march in the held breaths of every passenger, in the way they watched her like watching a verdict walk on 2 legs, one truth became undeniable. They thought they pushed a woman of color into the last row, but they had actually pushed the National Director of Aviation Safety into the perfect position to witness every one of their violations without missing a single detail. And from the instant she stepped into the jet bridge, the airline no longer held the advantage. The advantage had changed hands, and the person holding it was the one they believed unworthy of seat 1A. Adam Greer escorted Natalie down the jet bridge as if he were leading a judge into a courtroom. Not because she demanded deference, but because he understood that from the moment that aircraft door had closed, the entire airline had been standing in judgment, and Dr. Natalie Pierce was the only person present with the authority to deliver a verdict. The closer they came to the terminal entrance, the thicker the air grew. A group of 3 people in black suits waited ahead. One was the head of airport security. One was the regional FAA representative. The third, whose presence made Adam tighten his grip slightly, was a corporate attorney summoned solely because of a single email from a passenger seated in 35B. They all straightened the moment Natalie appeared. Evan stood in the aircraft doorway, watching eyes wide. He could not hear the conversation, but the sight of a woman who had been pushed to the last row, now being met by a lineup of officials, like a visiting head of state, left him breathless. While he tried to process it, Mark was escorted out behind him. His face was ashen, his eyes swollen, his breath unsteady. There was no trace of the arrogant man who had mocked a disruptive passenger. He did not dare look at Natalie as he passed, but he heard Adam's voice, clearly low and sharp. "You are suspended immediately. Remain silent and come with us." Mark opened his mouth, scrambling for an excuse. "I didn't know who she was." "I thought you did not need to know," Adam cut in. "You only needed to follow the rules. And you violated every rule that matters." The sentence struck Mark like an invisible blow. Adam turned to Natalie, his voice dropping into absolute respect. "We have forwarded an emergency report to headquarters. The COO is on his way. Based on what you described, this is no longer a customer incident. This is a system-level safety breach." Natalie did not react. "You will need all data prepared before I leave the airport. We will provide everything." She nodded. They entered a temporary conference room inside the terminal, where a round table was already covered in hastily printed documents and laptops logged into the airline's internal system. As soon as they sat, Adam brought up a large screen. On it was a live update from the FAST system, the Federal Aviation Safety Tracker. It had opened an investigation file, a red icon, a code level 4 alert, something reserved only for the most severe violations. The company's attorney stared at it, sweat forming on his forehead. We need to know the extent of what you intend to bring to the FAA." Natalie turned her pen in her hand, a small but precise motion, like preparing to sign a sanction order. "To the level necessary to ensure passenger safety and to end the culture of abuse I witnessed on that flight." Adam exhaled sharply, not out of fear of Natalie, but out of fear of the decaying system she had exposed in one short journey. But before they could continue discussing procedure, heavy, urgent footsteps echoed outside. The door flew open. The CEO of Global Crest Airlines, Christopher Langford, had arrived. His face was pale, the expression of a man who had just learned his entire fleet could be grounded. He looked at Natalie with the air of a student caught cheating, standing before the person who wrote the academic code. "Dr. Pierce," he said, breath faltering, "please allow me a chance to respond. I have just received the full cockpit communication summary. I promise we will act decisively." Natalie looked at him. Her expression carried no anger, no uncertainty, only the cold reflection of truth. "I do not need promises," she said. "I need change." Langford swallowed, voice cracking. "And you will have it. But I must ask the scale of the investigation you intend to present to the Senate and FAA. How extensive will it be?" Natalie placed her notebook on the table. Every line inside it was sharper than a blade. Every entry a cut into the airline's credibility. She did not raise her voice. She did not emphasize her words. Her tone was soft, but carried the weight of gravity. Enough to place the entire Los Angeles hub under special oversight. A legal officer behind the CEO gripped his chair so hard his knuckles whitened. Everyone in the room knew that special oversight was the phrase that made airlines tremble, a measure that brought surprise inspections, tens of millions in Viney's crew suspensions, and sometimes leadership changes. Langford lowered his head for a moment, as though absorbing a final verdict. But Natalie was not finished. She stood closing her notebook. "And I will submit my full report within 3 hours. What happened on that aircraft was not merely personal mistreatment. It revealed a system that is loose, unsupervised, and ethically compromised. If it is not corrected, it will cost lives." No one dared breathe after hearing that. She turned to Adam. "I want the complete training file of the purser, all past complaints, and the footage from Gate C-18. Adam nodded instantly. "I will deliver it in 10 minutes. The CEO stepped forward, as if trying to salvage something. "Dr. Pierce is there. Any possibility the airline can cooperate with the FAA before your report becomes part of the public record?" Natalie placed her bag on her shoulder. "That depends on how you handle your crew in the next 24 hours. He nodded rapidly. "I will. I will address it immediately." She held his gaze for one final beat, long enough for him to understand that the airline's survival no longer depended on its leadership, but on one word: discipline. Then she left the room. No one followed. They only watched her go as if a storm had passed through, leaving not destruction, but revelation. Evan was still standing at the aircraft doorway. His eyes widened as he saw Natalie walk through a corridor of security personnel and high-level executives like a sovereign entering judgment. He managed to whisper one sentence: "You really saved the flight." She stopped, looked at him. "No, I only recorded the truth." He inhaled as if hearing a fundamental doctrine. She continued, her voice gentle, but edged with steel. "And you will be the one who determines whether this airline changes or not." Evan straightened for the first time, looking exactly like a flight attendant trained to protect passengers. Natalie walked on. Each step was a warning sent to the entire aviation industry. Respect is not a courtesy. It is regulation. Safety is not a slogan. It is responsibility. And no one, absolutely no one, is allowed to forget that, especially when the person they tried to diminish in the last row is the one with the authority to rebuild the entire system from the ground up. The emergency meeting had ended, but its aftershocks followed Natalie with every step she took across the polished terminal floor. No one was escorting her anymore. None was needed. Her presence alone created a space others didn't dare to enter, a quiet force that made the entire airport seem to shift its axis around her stride. As she exited the internal security area, others erupted into motion behind her, as if responding to an alarm. Adam rushing to call department heads, the company's lawyers contacting the risk management team, airport security, shifting into high incident monitoring protocol. But Natalie did not look back. That was no longer her responsibility. She had triggered the process. Now the system had to answer for itself. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from the FAA Chief of Staff received notification from Global Crest. "If you need support, inform us immediately." Not interference, assurance. She did not respond. She simply kept walking. The distant boarding calls echoed overhead. The smell of coffee drifted from a nearby gate. A child cried somewhere behind her suitcase. Wheels clicked across tile, the familiar noise of aviation. But today, beneath all that sound, there was another pulse, the heartbeat of an airline trembling, because it realized it had pulled the wrong thread, one tied directly to the most powerful authority in the industry. Natalie passed a wide glass window. Outside the Global Crest aircraft she had flown on was now parked, jet bridge attached. The maintenance crew climbed aboard with the intensity of investigators entering a crime scene. She watched them for a moment, her gaze not judgmental, but assessing could they repair the structural rot their leadership had allowed. She headed toward the main exit. And there, unexpectedly, Evan appeared. No uniform. Just a thin jacket, a face still tense, but eyes brighter and steadier, as though the last few hours had compressed a lesson no airline training program had ever taught him. "I'm sorry for running after you," he said, breath uneven, "but I needed to thank you." Natalie stopped. A faint light crossed her eyes, not softness, but recognition. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "You only need to fulfill your role." Evan inhaled deeply. "You saw the moment I failed. When the turbulence hit, I froze. I thought I would be fired. I thought I wasn't meant for this job." "You did not fail," Natalie said. "You lacked guidance." Evan looked down. "Thank you for helping me stand back up from that moment." Natalie looked directly at him. "You will be evaluated again. You will retrain. You will correct your mistakes. But I wrote in the report that you have potential, and that potential will save lives if you do not let someone like Mark crush it." Evan stopped breathing for a second. His eyes reddened the kind of red that comes from feeling oneself restored to the right shape. "I won't let that happen again." "I hope so." Natalie walked a few steps before adding, without turning back, "Next time the cabin needs a leader, be the one who stands up." Evan stood still, watching her go, as if he had just received a mission he not only wanted to fulfill, but wanted to become worthy of. Natalie moved into the flow of people, disappearing into the crowd like a quiet shadow, but her impact radiated outward like a seismic wave. Meanwhile, on the other side of the airport, the real storm was forming. The emergency conference room at Global Crest headquarters, just a few gates away, was filled with controlled chaos. CEO Langford sat at the head of the table, his expression so severe even his assistants avoided eye contact. On the large monitor was a full transcription of Natalie's notes, every line forwarded directly to corporate headquarters and the FAA. 11 items. 11 violations. 11 causes that could lead to the suspension of all Los Angeles operations. Langford tapped his fingers on the table, sharp, fast, impatient. "Are all involved personnel suspended?" "Yes, sir. Mark and Linda's IDs have been confiscated. Evan has been assigned to mandatory retraining." "Good." Langford exhaled. How much time before the FAA's Special Oversight Team arrives? Less than 1 day. Another executive swallowed, hard voice, trembling. "If Dr. Pierce takes this report to the press, Langford cut him off. She doesn't need the press. She alone can disrupt our flight schedule for the next 3 months." No one argued, because it was true. In a corner of the room, the head of cabin crew training flipped open his laptop, hands shaking as he sifted through documents. We can revise the training procedures, present corrective plans before the FAA escalates further." Langford looked at him with cold disappointment. "You do not understand. This is not a documentation issue. This is a culture issue. We put someone like Mark in charge of a cabin. We let gate agents believe they have the authority to rank human beings." His gaze lifted to the final line of Natalie's notes. A short line, but one that silenced the entire room. Status systemic violation. Recommend full FAA audit. Langford sank into his chair, eyes losing the arrogance they once carried. "Fine," he said quietly. "Prepare cooperation protocols. There is no alternative." Meanwhile, in the airport's main hall, Natalie had called a car. She stood at the glass entrance, watching a Global Crest aircraft lift from the runway across the field. That aircraft, that airline, that system, and tomorrow all of them would answer the questions they had avoided for far too long. She touched her suitcase, the one containing the 400-page report. She did not smile, but her eyes held one undeniable truth. Her investigation was not over. It had only just begun. From the perspective of an aviation safety expert, Natalie Pierce's story exposes far more than the misconduct of a few individuals. It reveals a deeper truth that when a culture of abuse takes root inside an airline, every procedure, every standard, and every life is pushed to the edge of danger. Natalie's strength does not come from her title, but from her principle of never compromising in the face of disregard for human dignity. It is the weight of her silence that forced an entire system to confront itself. If you believe that justice begins with those who refuse to bow in the presence of wrongdoing, please like and subscribe to help amplify stories that awaken social responsibility. And leave a short comment. Hold standard.